All right. So like Steffi so eloquently laid the foundation for this topic, we are going to cover a country of 1.4 billion people and the world's second largest economy, and with a lot of hot button interesting issues ranging from dynamic COVID-0 to its stance on Russia-Ukraine to the US-China relations, everything in about 20 minutes. So no pressure with our two gentlemen, but we have the two super speakers today. I'll start with Professor Zhu Ning. He flew to Europe from Beijing last week. So I'm sure you've been asked this repeatedly. How was it like in Beijing? And other than that, in addition to that, how do you see the COVID policy is impacting China's economy this year?
Right, so I think that's the first question and the most question I have been getting ever since arrived in Germany. Well, I think for me it's not that bad actually. I mean, the lockdown policy in Beijing just now is just only taking place in certain parts of the city. I mean, but then people are saying, well, that's the same case with Shanghai 2 months ago. So I think it's really a very fluid situation. But for the moment, I think people can still come in and go out of the city without a problem. And for many of my colleagues and friends living in Shanghai, things are going towards into the other direction. So people who are under lockdown are gradually allowed to come out of their home, come out of their compound. So it is not to say the past 2 months have been easy, but this is a fairly fluid and unexpected situation. And I think things are gradually calming down. With that in the background, I think what's really concerning me as an economist is the impact that a COVID lockdown policy or this dynamic zero COVID policy is impacting China's growth. So there are probably 3 major lines of implications we're seeing. One is just direct lockdown. So that's just getting rid of so many of the scenarios for your consumption. So there's no dining in, there's no entertainment, there's no travel, there's no hoteling services for many cities in the country right now. And the second, which is probably broader, that's the supply chain disruption. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of super tankers which are waiting outside Shanghai to be loading and unloading. And there are lots of truck drivers who are waiting outside Shanghai. Probably they have been stranded on the highway for a week or weeks before they can reach their final destination. And there are lots of people who cannot travel between different cities for business purposes. Some of my students cannot graduate because they need an official seal, a stamp on their diploma, but they cannot get a diploma because the university is still under lockdown. So that's just touching different aspects of daily life and production. But I think what I probably am a little bit more worried about is the longer term implication, the confidence, the habits of living, the sort of the expectation about what's going to happen in the future. So I think that's probably what the government should work even harder on to restore and to maintain.
Yeah, thank you. And I will come back to some of the points, especially on the confidence points, and Joshua probably can comment on that. But before that, COVID is only one destabilizing factor. And like Steffi has laid out, we have the tech policies, we have also the real estate policies, this and that. So tell us a more comprehensive landscape of what do you see as the destabilizing factors this year, in addition to COVID?
Well, I'm really glad, Xin, that you didn't use the word crackdown, because I mean, there's been that word has been floating along for so many different industries. In my personal view, I don't think that's a crackdown. I think that's more of a correction or an adjustment. But if I were to say one thing about the destabilizing forces, I think in addition to COVID and the war in Ukraine, I think it's the changes, the expectation in changes. So I think we have been so used to the so-called predictable in China, both to foreigners and to Chinese nationals alike. But now I think so many changes are taking place at the very same time: the COVID, the economy, the growth, the industrial policy, the real estate. So I think that's just having such an unexpected and complicated impact on how people decide to, how do I live my life? Will I still have my job? What's my salary going to look like? Will I be able to keep my employee in the next 6 months if the lockdown were to continue? So I think that is really a fundamental change that I think is going to, I think, have just far-reaching impact on every single person in the economy. So I think that is the not necessarily destabilizing, but that is sort of the black swan that nobody has foreseen at the start of this year.
Yeah. And Joshua, I'll turn to you. The unexpected changes factor, is that very obvious among the international observers, global companies, investors?
I mean, I think it just changes, right? To some degree, they're unexpected, some degree not. I mean, the world is changing in fundamental revolutionary ways. And it's important to remember that China itself has changed dramatically, as we all know. I mean, the process of reform and opening began really just 40 years ago. You've had hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty. The amount of innovation that goes on in China, I think, is beyond what anybody could have expected. So I think maybe one useful thing to keep in mind is the kind of psychological background of unexpected, unimaginable change. There's a great debate outside of China now about China's great power and its economic success. But if you talk to people who've been engaged in China for 30 or 40 years, nobody imagined this was possible. I mean, there are famous stories of, those of you who know China maybe know Shanghai and Pudong, which used to be a swamp and is now a global financial center. Famous stories of the Shanghai mayor taking people on cruises up and down saying, we're going to turn this swampland into a giant, progressive, incredibly successful area. And, nobody even knew what Tesla was at that point. The idea that Disney would have something there was just unimaginable, or Starbucks. So I think an important kind of background context is to remember that China is a place that is the Chinese, will often tell you, 发展中的一个国家. It's a developing country. It's not finished its process of development. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. What I've been very struck by in the couple times I've been to China since COVID hit is that incredible internal dynamism. And I think as you raised this question of kind of what's ahead, that's the puzzle, right? That in addition to this kind of massive economic movement in industrial terms that we could have expected, right? The industrialization, the low-cost labor. The kind of magic sauce of China that has surprised everybody so much has been this incredible energy of innovation. This ability to produce, not just world-class products. And one of the things people say is China's not just exporting products anymore, but business models. Companies like ByteDance, which has TikTok, or companies like Shein, which is one of the most significant retailers in the world now. So when you assess the overall situation, one question is, where does that kind of magic extra energy come from, and what's necessary to kind of perpetuate that? And I'll tell you one thing I still find, even in the midst of lockdowns, like I'm sure both of you, I talked to a lot of friends in Shanghai, and I mean, it's an extraordinary experience, to be locked up like this. But that spirit of innovation, that desire to create, I find so far has not been extinguished. And so the question is, what can be done to accelerate and bring that back to life?
The real source of resilience of China.
Yeah, so far. I mean, people have a sense of high expectations because of what they've lived through in the last 40 years. But what I've seen practically among young Chinese, which is one of these things that it's very, very hard. I'll give you an example of this. So in China, there's a very significant generation. One of the things about China is if you're born in the West, basically, my life and my parents' life was the same life story, right? The music is different, but like the basic story is different. China's not like that. China has changed so much that if you were born in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, or 90s, your experience of life has been totally different. It's not just that the music is different, which it is, it's that your day-to-day activity, the way you think about and dream about what might be possible is different. The post-90s generation, the post-95 generation, people in their 30s and 40s, were at the earliest phases of COVID. You found this incredible sense of generational identity. And that desire to build a life for themselves, to become part of the middle class, I don't find that diminished at all yet. And so the question is, what is necessary to create a context in which that energy can release itself?
Well said. That's on the China side, but on the global side, I'm sure you're asked many times, just as Professor Zhu was asked about the situation in China, you probably were asked about now with the sanction on Russia, many are asking if there is any possibility of sanction on China, how should they hedge? And even without the sanction in mind, with the increasing strategic competition between US and China, how can global companies hedge? So how would you answer them?
I think we've entered most of us, when I think about coming to DLD in, the early days, because the thing I think the most about, as Steffi mentioned, was the incredible additional benefits that came with coming to DLD. But, most of us in this room who have been in our careers have lived through a period in which economics was more important than politics to some degree, or there was a political agreement that you would build the most efficient economic system that you could. What's changing now, which is the historical norm, is that political and security considerations are becoming more important than economic efficiency considerations. And these things always move in a pendulum, right? You have periods of incredible openness and periods of incredible closeness. And so I think that's where we are today. You are seeing globally, I think, the development of a desire for more resilient supply chains. I think that's actually probably a healthy thing to some degree. But I don't think the era of globalization is over. I think it's just kind of changing shape. The way I think about it is sort of starting at the end of the Cold War, you had this period of globalization, which we all lived through and produced things like, the Tom Friedman, McDonald's peace theory, or the world is flat. If you just open McDonald's everywhere, there won't be any wars. Starting in about 2008, we entered a period of deglobalization with the financial crisis, where you saw global financial capital, cross-border flows actually went into reverse. But what we're starting to see now is not deglobalization, but it is reglobalization, which is the building of a new topology of trade, of finance. That includes things like crypto, that includes things like digital-only businesses like ByteDance that we were just talking about. And so I think that dynamic of globalization, which was based around efficiency, which was based about a very kind of simple global operating system, is now being reglobalized into a whole new topology. And the fight is not over the globalized topology, that's gone. The fight is about what does this new reglobalized topology look like? And so companies are inevitably having to shift how they operate in that world.
Mm. And then from the China perspective, like Joshua said, in a re-globalized world, Professor Zhu, do you think China still needs foreign capital, or needs foreign talent, or needs the involvement of foreign multinational companies?
Well, I think short answer is yes. I think China is still very much open to foreign capital, to foreign talent, and foreign know-how, management know-how. I think China is still in a stage, I think as Joshua pointed out very correctly, I think in China, in the past 4 decades, it's almost always the two drivers pushing China forward. One is the openness, one is the reform. And some even argue it's the opening up, it's the opening to the West that is inducing further reforms domestically. So I think that is, setting everything else aside, this is very important for China to reform itself going forward. So I think it's very much needed and welcome. That being said, I think there's one change which is, I think, in my mind, very, very important, which may not have caught as much attention as it should overseas, is I think China is, as Joshua pointed out, in the past decade or decades, growth is the most important driver or objective of all policy making. Economy, growth. But I think starting not just around COVID, I think starting several years ago, I think it's gradually shifting. So I think it's more about, in my mind, what we call a high quality growth. So in the past, it's about fast. Now I think it's more inclusive. So the common prosperity, which we talked about last year, is about more inclusive common prosperity. It's about more sustainable, the sort of avoiding systematic financial risks. And it's also more eco-friendly, the double zero in carbon emissions. So I think China is going through, because it's hard to imagine, as Joshua pointed out, 40 years ago, the GDP per capita was less than $500 per year, per capita. Now it's over $12,000 per capita per year. So this giant leap in the wealth, in the income, is changing so many things. And then China is sort of reaching a point that we're not running a 100-meter sprint, we're running a marathon. So now it's more important to keep running, avoid stumbling. So I think this is the very fundamental changes which is taking place in China, which I think the rest of the world is not fully aware of. So that's why I think people are sort of caught off guard saying, things are changing. Things are not just changing now. Things are gradually changing, but it's not attracting as much attention. So I think that's not just the rest of the world. It's China itself is going through this very fundamental and very, in my view, very healthy transition into a more higher quality growth model.
That's fascinating. And to Joshua as well, like Professor Zhu said, now China is changing. People cannot come here for the sprint. They have to come here for the marathon. And are Western companies prepared to do that? And if you advise them to come to China now and what they should bear in mind, what they should look out for?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the fascinating things about being in China right now is just to touch again on this kind of point of the way in which the domestic environment is shifting. It's very clear that the priority is not simply around growth. You need growth. That's the prerequisite, and I think the goal of the party and the society is getting as many people into the middle class as possible. Middle class is another thing just to remember historically is most of the leaders of the country of China, today are people who lived through the Cultural Revolution, the Wenke. So they've had the experience of instability. They've seen things that those of us in the West have not seen in terms of the collapse of a society. They have a historical feeling about the implications of political decisions that really most of us are blind to. And when you talk to them, this music is constantly playing in the back of their minds. And if you want to understand China without understanding the personal biography of Xi Jinping or Wang Qishan or Liu He or Wang Huning, these kind of people, it's just impossible to separate them from the circumstances in which they emerged. So that base kind of desire to have stability, I think, informs a tremendous amount. So economic growth matters, and that's a piece of it, because we know having people in the middle class, as Bismarck and Disraeli and others discovered, that was the key to stability, right? Everybody thought in Europe there were going to be massive revolutions with industrialization, but when people get in the middle class, they don't want to burn their homes down. They just want to kind of have a better life for their children. So that exists as a prerequisite. But what's remarkable to me is the incredible dynamism of the innovation of products that are being developed in China. You even see that in the pandemic. I mean, some of the activity we've done in investment, for instance, around questions of health tech. The rollout, like one of the things the last couple of years has basically done is wiped out a lot of the concern about the intersection of AI, surveillance, and health tech. So China is going to become, as a result of deployment, really a leader in next-generation health tech technologies. So in terms of international companies, it changes the landscape in which they operate. I'm on the board of Starbucks, right? It used to be that you just show up and serve Starbucks coffee to everybody, and they thought it was terrific. Starbucks has great local competitors now who have really interesting products and are terrific on social media. And so I think the challenge for international companies to understand just how good the local competitive environment is and that they can't take it for granted. The second thing I'd say for international companies is one of the things I've seen a lot in some of the transactions that we work on is that the amount of innovation that's going on in China is now something that companies feel they have to participate in. I'll give you an example. If you get in a Chinese car these days, the next generation of Chinese cars, the way that the glass is designed inside the driver's part of the cockpit is like unlike anything you've seen. It's like twisted, and there's like stuff going over your head. I mean, it's really extraordinary. And a friend of mine who works in the automotive space and is a client that we do some work with said, the thing for us about getting shut out of China if we couldn't operate there is we would miss out on all the innovation. That there's so much innovation going on because the market is so competitive that being there is not simply a matter of being successful for selling your product. It's also a place where you can learn a lot.
Thank you. And we're coming to the end, but I will ask our speakers one last simple question with a very short answer. So for Professor Zhu, that's when do you think the COVID-0 will exit? And for Joshua, well, it's not a simple question, but how do you think the US-China competition will be in 5 years? Can you answer in one sentence?
You go first.
Well, I think my best bet would be it will be sometime next year at the same time right now.
I mean, it's going to take more than one sentence, but I'll try to do quickly, which is that the two sides today are increasingly locked in a dynamic which is unsustainable and not survivable, not simply for the two countries, but for the planet. It increasingly resembles two people in a sinking boat fighting over an oar. The reality is we are facing a world of global existential problems, whether that is global warming, the proliferation of cyber weapons, inequality, disease spreads. The great tragedy of the next 50 years is not going to be US-China conflict. It will be if the US and China are unable to work together on these problems that are going to determine the fate of humanity.
It's very important, and it's also echoing the DLD theme, reality rules. And respecting the reality corporation is the necessary step forward. So with that, please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists today.